like expectation.
Sorry.
Which is, if you look at it, sort of, if you didn't know it was called hope, you would think it was anything but hope, unless you consider Pandora's box and hope that remains at the bottom of the box and could be assimilated to the worst of the sort of problems that emerge from this box. And what depicts hope personified, sitting atop a planet Earth, looking dejected, playing a lyre where you can hardly see, but there's only one string that she can still play. Hope is blinded, possibly a reference to Achilles' drama Prometheus Bound, where the Titan gives mankind blind hope, so that, mankind is blinded to their future deaths. So the picture seems to bespeak despair rather than hope. Some Victorians, however, have explored fascinating ways of working out this fundamental emotion into forms of economic thinking that border on spirituality. And these Victorian approaches paved the way for the definition of an economics of hope that could be relevant to us today. So I thought of a few examples. I thought of Middlemarch, and I decided, being a Dickensian, I went back to my Dickensian to play it safe, but we can discuss Middlemarch if you like later. So I chose to explore Great Expectations. This novel, oops, it's not cooperating. This is just not moving forward at all anymore. Oops, seems blocked. Try now. Ah, super. Thank you. Dickens, in fact, explores the very notion of expectations by spelling it out in various ways and by studying the implications of these variants. It starts by outlining aspirations, anticipations of a very rational kind, similar to those studied by mainstream economics today. And then it stresses the shortcomings of these variants and gradually moves towards a more complex definition of hope that proves instrumental to the evolution of economic thought today. So I'm going to start with something which I call patient hope and the 18th century idea of progress. My contention is that Pip's trajectory of hope can help us face the global crises we are experiencing today. I will first show how the hopes of young Pip express preferences that are socially conditioned by his close environment. So when we first discover him at the beginning of the novel, Pip has the feeling that his future is all set. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe. Pip takes it for granted that he'll work with Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, in the Kentish village where they live on the edge of the marshes, and he's proud of this social and economic prospect. As the later and adult narrator of this story, he recalls seeing himself as a working-class hero, similar in some respects to the proud blacksmith depicted in Joseph Bright of Derby's famous painting. You see this painting here, and I'm going to develop this. What Pip experiences at this stage is a sense of coherence that emerges from his statement, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, simple statement. And this corresponds to what sociologist Aaron Antonovsky has defined as a feeling of confidence derived from an environment perceived as predictable and structured. This consistency gives rise to patient hope whose power plays out in the mind and the body. And this is a very physical picture here. As you can see, this prospect of becoming a blacksmith. And we can even say that Pip and the blacksmith here partake of the idea of progress inherited from the Enlightenment. It's the idea that if everybody rolls up their sleeves, collective progress can be achieved and society will move forward, even if this implies some problems or sacrifices. Pip's hopes for the future exemplify what the French philosopher Georges Canguilhem described as the first phase of progress going back to 18th century philosophy. And this first phase of progress, according to Canguilhem, is characterized by linearity, stability, and symbolized by light. And seems to me that this light that radiates in this picture sort of points to this idea. But of course, it's the idea of progress, because as we know, and as we saw in papers that we heard yesterday, progress in the 18th century also involved slavery and all forms of inequality. Tarnished hope, critical hope, disrupting the idea of progress. Pip's encounter with Miss Havisham and Estella from the upper class, will change his initial perceptions. After meeting Miss Havisham and Estella, Pip experiences self-content and contempt for his class. It's filled with shame and frustration. And in doing so, he expresses what the behavioral economist Esther Miriam Sent has described as dynamic economic preferences subject to context, relationship to others, and subjectivity. The shift in perspective comes from the fact that Pip now sees himself and his surroundings through the eyes of the contemptuous upper classes. This phenomenon is all the more schizophrenic as Pip, coming from the working class, now sees the world from this upper class perspective, but without being able to rise above his working class condition. I never shall or can be comfortable or anything but miserable unless I can lead a very different sort of life from the life I lead now. So Pip's growing dissatisfaction with his social milieu and environment gives rise to a form of alienation neurosis. He's obsessed at the idea that Estella might one day see him working at the forge, and he dreads the extreme humiliation that this would awaken in him. This single thought turns into a fixation, leading to visions verging on hallucination, which illustrators of the novels picked up upon. For example, this 1910 illustration by Harry Furniss, which shows Estella appearing in the fire while Pip is hammering away. Now, interestingly, here we have a form of the energy that was present in the forge that fueled the progress is now sort of dissipated by Pip's insatisfaction. And if you think of dissipation, you also think of physics and the principle of entropy developed by Lord Kelvin. And Georges Canguilhem sort of developed the idea that the combination of dissipation of energy that you can see here added to a sense of social economic inequality in industrial society disrupted the idea of progress. However, in spite of this, Pip develops, oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Pip develops a form of resolute hope in the face of hopelessness. The perception that his future is blocked makes life unbearable for him. He feels deeply unhappy, but this doesn't make him lose all hope. And I'm exploring various forms of hope. And I hope as you listen to me, sort of think, you know, how these forms of hope can inform the way we navigate the present, in fact. In this case, the feeling that Pip has no room to maneuver and that he's trapped or imprisoned doesn't lead him to apathy. He tries to raise himself despite the odds through education, while realizing that this will not be enough to change his condition. And this behavior contradicts a theory that economic theory that's well known in development studies, according to which when individuals are plunged into utter poverty, they sink into despair. But here, the trap is a little bit different because Pip isn't poor. Blacksmiths at the time made a good living, but Pip still feels trapped in his working class condition. And but the trap here doesn't preclude hope and action, even if this action may be useless, if you like. So I'm now going to move on to confident hope in the form of seemingly rational expectations. Now, Pip's aspirations are not going to stay vain, remain vain. His aspirations to become a gentleman come true unexpectedly when, by a twist of fate, the lawyer Mr. Jaggers tells him that he has great expectations. An expression that's normally applied to young heirs, except that here Pip is not an heir. And just for the pleasure of it, you know, we all know this quotation, but I'm instructed to communicate to him, said Mr. Jaggers, throwing his finger at me sideways, that he will come into a handsome property. Further, that it is the desire of the present possessor of that property that he be immediately removed from his present sphere of life and from this place, and be brought up as a gentleman, in a word, as a young fellow of great expectations. Now, this leads Pip to a sense of liberation and emancipation. His hopes of wealth and social ascension can now be fulfilled. His horizon opens up. Until then, he sort of felt that the Kentish marshes he was in had become a very closed environment. He could only discern the faces of Estella and Miss Havisham against them. And suddenly this opens up, this horizon opens up. He has a new prospect. And remember, prospect is one of the terms that economists use in their models and their theories. So he's now confident that his financial situation will be secure, and he prepares himself on the basis of that for a match in the sense given to this by the economist Gary Becker, who has worked a lot on marriages and how people calculate to marry the right person and the kind of things that they choose to do in order to select that person. So Pip enters a phase of optimism. His social rise leads to a calculated and confident expectations. So from an economic point of view, his behavior is characterized by a selfish approach that believes itself to be rational in its goal, and I'm going to use an economic term here, of maximizing his interests. So he wants to become rich and cultivated, and in order to do, and this is the means that he considers necessary to be able to claim Estella's hand. So it's called a set of calculations here, what economists call calculating one's utility. And Pip believes that's another important notion, that he has complete information about his situation, including the name of his patron, whom he's sure he has guessed. and he thinks that he's therefore master of his fate. Now, this brings me to a very important theory in economics that's called rational expectations. And in rational expectations, so he's going to make his matrimonial choices according to sort of very economic theories. In rational expectations, some economists, or not some economists, in rational expectations says that people think about the future is just about, how do we think about the future? What are our assumptions? And how do we model life on the basis of that? It's a very important thought. And here, the idea is that nobody can predict the future perfectly, but rational expectations theory assumes that on average, people's expectations about the future will be accurate because they form their expectations on a rational basis using all the information available to them optimally. That's exactly what Pip does. And Robert Lucas has won the Nobel Prize for this theory. So Pip here becomes an individualistic and calculating agent intent on maximizing his well-being, a homo economicus of sorts. And remember, homo economicus is a concept that was first developed by John Stuart Mill in an essay that sort of presented the beginning of political economy, because Dickens' sort of writing coincides with a completely different way of thinking about the economy and the discipline economics that is the one that we've inherited today. In economics, in fact, Homo economicus is a fiction, which is an interesting thought because you have, economics using fiction, and we are studying fiction as literary specialists. And the fiction of Homo economicus in economics is an abstraction. And if you want to understand how it works, you need to think about, for example, Plato's myth of the cavern. And Homo economicus, sort of rational and selfish, is a character that economists have constructed to model the economy, to try and represent the economy. And this character has been criticized lately as an inaccurate representation of reality that doesn't sufficiently factor in feelings or empathy. So with these new expectations, Pip begins to formulate preferences that are characteristic of the Victorian gentleman's status regarding the objects he buys, the servants he employs, and the life of leisure that he embraces. And he displays what economic theory describes as consumer confidence. Now, what is very striking is that this economic rationality is in fact filled with irrationality. Because Pip's certainty about his marital future is based on a purely subjective interpretation of his situation. He thinks that Miss Havisham is his benefactress, and on the basis of that, he thinks that she wishes to make him into a gentleman so that he can marry her adopted daughter Stella. As pointed out by Corinne Pelluchon, a French philosopher, lately in 2023, the feeling of hope, by ensuring a state of confidence, expectation, even conviction, that what we are waiting for can or must come true, tends to short-circuit the principle of reality insofar as the latter is the bearer of judgments ascertaining that our inner wishes do not necessarily correspond to what can be found in reality. So, with Herbert Pocket, his roommate, Pip begins to overconsume and run into debt, treating his high expectations as if they were unlimited. We spent as much money as we could and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We were always more or less miserable, and most of our acquaintance were in the same condition. Pip justifies these expenditures to himself through pseudo-deliberations. How many of us practice such pseudo-deliberations? They engage in lengthy sessions of examination of their accounts. They carefully list all their debts, and then at the end of the day, they grant themselves another few additional margins of unfunded credit, declare themselves extremely satisfied with their accountancy, and don't change anything to their lavish habits. Now, the novel ironically points out that Pip's economic rationality is not rational at all. Like Mr. Micawber in the novel David Copperfield, he professes financial rigor, but doesn't follow his own principles. This is what Mr. Micawber says. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, he says this to David repeatedly. Annual expenditure, £19, 19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20, 0 and 6. Result, misery. Now that's all very well, but everybody who knows Mr. Micawber knows that he doesn't apply his own principles ever. And that's where it becomes quite funny. The Micawber principle of budget equilibrium has been taken up by standard economic theory. And they have a principle, the Micawber principle, but it doesn't mention the second facet. So look, this is a very serious article from the Journal of Public Economics that states the Micawber principle is essential to budgeting. That's really interesting. But as I prepared this, I suddenly realized it's quite subtle, in fact, because the question is, and it really brings us into sort of depths that we kind of, that the text says, it is not the level of income and outgo, but their relationship that matters, which is quite interesting. And the whole question here, which is something that I'd like to investigate, is what is it exactly that economics has found in the Micawber principle? And Micawber has fascinated economists. Is it the rationality, the irrationality? Is it some kind of depth that economic theory hasn't fathomed, but still has has felt and applied in their journals? Because this principle applies time and time again in economic journals. So Dickens clearly, at any rate, had grasped the complexity and ambivalence of human behavior in relation to debt. So despite, or maybe because of his good fortune, Pip actually loses his economic autonomy and agency. And this sense of, again, when we think about, you know, what are our hopes? What kind of agency do we have when we hope? And here, he's rich, but he has become an instrument. He's educated and provided with substantial sums of money to fulfill his desire to become a gentleman, but his destiny is shaped from the outside. And he even starts manipulating other people, like wanting to lift the blacksmith Joe Gargery out of his social condition. Not so much, and again, analyzing motivations, not because he is altruistic, but because he's ashamed of being in the presence of someone who is now who is working class now that he has climbed the social ladder. And similarly, he tries to help Herbert Pocket less out of generosity as out of various reasons, because he feels guilty about having supplanted him, or so he thinks, as Miss Havisham's protege, or by encouraging him to overspend. Herbert is like Pip, but in a very different way, a high-hope individual who believes, like Mr. Micawber, that there's always something that will turn up. Here is what we read about Herbert. I noticed that he looked about him with a desponding eye at breakfast time, that he began to look about him more hopefully about midday, that he drooped when he came to dinner, that he seemed to descry capital in the distance rather clearly after dinner, that he all but realized capital towards midnight, and that about 2 o'clock in the morning he became so highly despondent again as to talk of buying a rifle and going to America with the general purpose of compelling buffaloes to make his fortune. And we can see here how hope sort of plays out in the mind and the body. And this kind of behavior where you sort of wait for something to turn up is another element that economic theory has used. And it's called the Micawber principle. It's not stated as such, but you have books like David Smith, The British Economy, Past, Present and Future. Something will turn up, which is really amusing. So contrary to what standard economic theory claims, positive expectations and confidence don't translate into greater well-being in Pip. There was a great gay fiction among us that we were constantly enjoying ourselves, and a skeleton truth that we never did. To the best of my belief, our case was in the last aspect a rather common one. And what strikes me here about the mind, the body, is this expression skeleton truth, which is an interesting metaphor relating the body and the mind emotion and cognition, because it's all about how the body, the mind, emotion brings cognition, and the kind of knowledge that you can draw from emotions. In any case, this masquerade of happiness resembles Pascalian entertainment from the philosopher Pascal, transposed into a context of overconsumption characteristic of Victorian England, where we have the emergence of a credit economy, a consumer society, and as we all know, the proliferation of objects, and still know, proliferation of objects that are no longer justified by need, but that are catered to want, which has been very aptly described by Baudrillard in La Société de Consommation. So Pip's feelings, again, the mind, the body, are confused, and this underscores how important complexity and ambiguity are to the understanding of our economic behaviors. At this point in the novel, Pip experiences a kind of emotional dissonance, and this is something, emotional dissonance is when you're sort of split, and this is found very much, for example, today in, say, call centers, telephone call centers, where people are told to pretend that they are somebody else. And this is a phenomenon that's analyzed today very deeply by forms of management, and this appears already here very clearly. So he experiences a sort of emotional dissonance of being sort of schizophrenic, and this questions his personal journey and the fruitfulness of his hopes. He indulges in bad faith and self-deception. For example, when he goes back to see Miss Havisham on one occasion, he chooses to sleep at the inn rather than go and see Joe, and he comments in retrospect, "All other swindlers upon earth are nothing to the self-swindlers, and with such pretenses did I cheat myself." And when one sort of examines oneself, it resonates very deeply, I think, in us readers as well. So from despair to the birth of faith, so sort of body, mind, spirituality, towards a more philosophical and spiritual conception of hope in economics. A new twist marks the beginning of the third phase of Pip's hopes, when he discovers the true identity of his benefactor and realizes that everything he has imagined was false, and that consequently everything he had taken for granted was only a mirage. Now, when, interestingly, I was thinking of the difference between French and, I've forgotten one word here, French and English. In French, we have two words. We have l'espoir and le désespoir. In English, you have hope, despair, and hopelessness. So, what category are we going to fall into in English? So when his real benefactor, Abel Magwitch, the convict, makes himself known to him, Pip realizes how wrong he has been about the origin of his great expectations and about the matrimonial prospects he has harbored. And his projections were thus only illusions, and Estella, the star he had aspired to reach, hence the star-lit sky I had put at the very beginning, becomes unattainable again. And in this respect, Pip has behaved, again in economic terms, as an over-optimistic investor who maintained a distorted vision of reality and who on this basis developed imprudent behavior. His naive optimism, based on no tangible evidence, allowed Miss Havisham to deceive him. Now, in this new situation, Pip develops a new economic agency that serves a more altruistic hope. He experiences, and I find that the screen capture here is very striking in that respect, what critic Wendy Parkins calls a kind of Levinasian understanding of ethical obligation avant la lettre. Now, Levinas, the 20th century philosopher, talked about the face of the other. The face of the other who summons me to respond, makes an ethical demand on me, which places me under an obligation. And this new feeling of obligation disrupts self-absorption. So in his misfortune, and again, I think we can think about us in present situation, In his misfortune, Pip paradoxically recovers real economic agency. He's no longer a passive puppet. He can and must take his destiny in hand. How much, does this kind of consideration concern us, speak to us today? He becomes the actor of his destiny again, and in doing so, he starts to pursue goals more general and existential than those he had pursued previously. In the last section of the novel, he revolves from a rather irresponsible navel-gazing behavior to a more altruistic and responsible attitude. He evolves from ingratitude to gratitude and becomes concerned with righting the wrongs he has caused. When we think of climate change, progress, how much do such things sort of resonate, and how could this play out in possible economic models? Pip is helped by this, by the example set by his benefactor Magwitch. Magwitch returns to England at the peril of his life to see Pip. His boast that he had made me a gentleman and that he had come to see me support the character on his ample resources was made for me quite as much as for himself. In Magwitch's mind, the pleasure of seeing Pip as a gentleman is a shared pleasure. Magwitch is unconcerned about himself. His hopes are focused on Pip, who embodies the social revenge, but also a deep gratitude that he feels towards the little boy who once helped him in the Kentish marshes when he was trying to escape from the prison ships. So at the end of the novel, Pip will draw on this relational conception of hope conveyed by Magwitch. Economics of care. As Robin Gilmore has shown, Pip, at this point of the novel, may no longer be a gentleman in the social sense, but he becomes a more authentic gentleman at heart, a gentleman, gentilhomme. And this adjective gentle refers to the idea of caring and benevolence, a propensity that was already latent in Pip's relationship with Herbert, and that's confirmed in the evolution of his relationship with Magwitch. He will help Magwitch, who has come back to England at the peril of his life, and where he could be sentenced to death if he were found. He's going to help exfiltrate him from England. This attitude goes against the apparent rationality which Pip previously sort of entertained towards his self-interest, and that was in keeping with today's mainstream economics. His new stance are now informed by ethics of care, in which economic that resonate with economic models developed over the past 20 years. In these models, new or other qualities are put forward, such as altruism, mutual support, cooperation, trust and sensitivity, paving the way for more humane economics and possibly a more humane economy. So Great Expectations thus delineates what the French economist Emmanuel Petit, with whom I published an article on related to hope in the Cahiers d'économie politique. He described a humanistic, effective and personal economics that are infused with solicitude and concern for others. Pip is also influenced by the behavior of other characters in the novel. Mr. Jaggers is an interesting character, again, a case of emotional dissonance, professional, but also trying to take care into account on one occasion in which he selects a pretty little girl, which in itself is ethically problematic among all the little girls that are miserable little girls, takes her away from her mother, who is a working class mother convicted of murder, or accused of murder, not convicted at the end, and gives her to this rich lady to be raised as a lady, which is sort of raises an ethical dilemma. So, birth of a new hope, role of emotions, experience and subjectivity in economics. At the end of the novel, Pip has lost his fortune, but he has found an internal coherence that gives him a kind of peace. And this coherence doesn't result from the match that I mentioned earlier, sort of economic, between his financial means and his matrimonial aspirations, but rather it's a harmony between himself, others, and the world. So the novel closes with a final perspective that is important to the conception of hope conveyed by the novel. Pip has stumbled upon Estella in the now abandoned garden of Satis' house, where he has gone to meditate. The house has been abandoned, and he comes across Estella, and as he stands beside the young woman contemplating the landscape, Pip notices that the horizon is opening up again, so prospect. And as the morning mists had risen long ago when I left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now. In all the broad expanse of tranquil light, they showed to me I saw no shadow of another parting from her. This is a lithograph of 1898 from the Gadsden edition. Now, the light of space, back to the light that we had at the beginning, remember the light of the forge? This is a different form of light, revealed by the dissipating evening vapors, delivers a more open perspective, and the space that opens up here and expands is no longer that of the closed perspectives of the beginning. It's not the well-defined, circumscribed goals of the second phase of Pip's expectations. The space that now emerges has to be navigated without having any certainties. Again, does this make any sense today? It's the exact opposite of the economic theory of rational expectations. Radical uncertainty is what we seem to be heading towards today, and we need to work out how to face it. The Victorians had anticipated such questions. A famous statement attributed to Socrates is, "I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing." Uncertainty here is not considered as a hindrance to the construction of our lives and projects, a source of anguish when compared to a reassuring anticipation of the future, which is, as I said, economics has an aversion to uncertainty. And economist Robert Boyer, in his Epistemology of Economics of 2021, says the emergence of radical uncertainties calls for an aggiornamento of the theory of rationality in economics. So the notion of economics of hope takes on its full meaning in a setup like the one that ends the novel Great Expectations. The kind of hope that the novel ends upon is more spiritual than rational. It's not an individual-centered hope, but a hope that includes a relational and moral dimension. Pip has moved from patient hope that generates a form of passivity to dashed hopes that cause sadness and frustration, and he's finally embraced something that's more like faith. So we've moved from sort of thought to faith, spirituality. Remember, faith, hope, and love are also the three theological virtues. And we can wonder whether they inform the sort of economics of hope outlined by the novel Great Expectations. And in particular, sort of the idea of charity, because love in these theological virtues is not sort of that sort of love for a woman here. It's more the idea of charity that has developed now into sort of a more less religious idea of solidarity, agapes caritas. So Pip's hope at the end of the novel includes an ethical dimension, that of care, and it partakes of a more collective and relational hope. And it's a hope that includes in its own perspective, it's not hoping for oneself, but including other people's hope in one's own, collective hope, the hopes of Magwitch, those of Herbert, those of Estella, and even those of the repentant Miss Havisham. It is this new kind of hope that Pip instills in all his actions, including his economic choices. So Dickens's Great Expectations contributes to rethinking the character of Homo economicus, and it chimes with forms of economics that are developing today, such as behavioral economics, economics of care, economics of emotion, and economics of hope that don't exist, but some economists from the Netherlands are calling for the development of this form of economics. And this is part of a reflection that sort of goes along with that. So I hope I've managed to show through this example how Victorian literature can help to re-include, and I insist on the idea of re-including because feelings were not completely omitted from economic theory before the end of the 19th century. But they have developed since the 19th century until now into something that's, has sort of discarded things like emotions. So re-include this human subjectivity and in particular hope into economic analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking lecture. And I would like to, there's one now already.
Yes, thank you for that fascinating talk.